Thank you for choosing to listen to PhoenixFire today. PhoenixFire features John Anthony West. You can access the PhoenixFire blog at www.jawphoenixfire.blogspot.com. You can learn more about John Anthony West by going to www.jawest.net. PhoenixFire.
PhoenixFire number 10.
This is PhoenixFire. John Anthony West, rogue Egyptologist and mystic in skeptics' clothing, broadcasting from Westhenge in the wilderness with something to offend everyone. Welcome to the conflagration.
2 weeks in Egypt. The 5-star revolution.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to PhoenixFire 10, which has been 2 years in the making, or 2 years in the preparation. In any event, even with my normal inefficiency and dilatoriness and procrastination, it shouldn't have taken 2 years. But the pressure of work plus a number of other developments, work-related developments, has made it impossible to get to this PhoenixFire 10 any sooner than this. And even this is not going to be the continuation of PhoenixFire 9, the Four Cowboys of Apocalypse 2.0, as it was planned, simply because this is more urgent, as it were. And so the additional PhoenixFire episodes, which we're supposed to cover, having already covered capitalism, or most of capitalism, are supposed to be patriotism, democracy, and technology, to cover all four of the cowboys. Will have to stay on hold still longer, and I'm going to be getting into here several other related issues. They don't sound as though they're related, but they are. And in the old adage of first you tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. As a part of the introduction here, I was in Egypt. I just got back about a week ago, and I was there for the entire revolution. So I have a somewhat different perspective on it from everything that you've heard in the press, BBC, CNN, all of the pundits and experts and journalists who I tend to call prostitutes chiming in. You got one side from them or one picture from them that was not necessarily a lie, but it was also not the whole truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So my experiences were, and my group was quite different, and I'd like to pass that on to everyone, and that'll be about a third of this episode. And then we're going to get into actually the work that I've been doing. Really, one of the reasons why it's taken me so long to get on PhoenixFire 10 is that a couple of years ago, I reconnected. It's not that I ever lost the connection, but I've been working nonstop with a good friend of mine and colleague, the trend forecaster, Gerald Celente, who I've been working with on and off for the last 30 years, actually. We co-wrote together a book in the 90s called Trends 2000. And most of the things that we forecast, Jerry is the forecaster, Celente is the forecaster with a remarkable capacity for connecting the dots in 3 dimensions. And I'm his writer, philosopher, historian in residence, not exactly in the background, but crafting the words in a way, adding a dimension to the forecasts. And basically, because he's been right about just about everything that's going on now, he's much in the news and needed the additional help. I mean, all of a sudden, he's on the air and on television all the time. And basically, I've been on call nonstop, pretty much the last 2.5 years, working with him, which has precluded me doing almost anything else of my own apart from my Egypt trips. So talk about that more in the second part of this PhoenixFire episode. And then finally, after all this time, the sequel to our Emmy Award-winning NBC documentary, Mystery of the Sphinx, because now we have the smoking gun that we've been looking for in order to nail this one down once and for all, and that's connected to the sponsor who will be sponsoring providing at least a big chunk of the money, which leads in turn to elements that have to do both with the Egypt experience and with the trend forecasting experience and with finding a way to survive what's coming up, because what's coming up is not a pretty picture. And that's another documentary actually based upon gold, though it doesn't sound at the moment as though it's connected. As I ramble on, you'll see that it is. So anyway, first story is Egypt, what I call the 5-star revolution, because that was our experience. And myself and our group, I've learned to get to Egypt a day earlier to de-jet lag. So I and about a group of 20, about 5 other people, were on the Egypt airplane on the 26th. The protests started not in a big, huge way on the 25th. So we arrived, 26th, we arrived on the 27th. Yeah, January, right. I'm talking about January. And we arrived on the 27th, and by this time, the protests were gathering steam. But nevertheless, we were okay. Our rep met us at the airport, and without any trouble at all, we got over to our hotel, which is right by Giza. It's one of the great hotels of the world, called the Mina House. It's built in, the palace part was built in, or opened in 1885 as a rest house for the Empress Josephine, commemorating the opening of the Suez Canal. A wonderful hotel. Anyway, we got there, and no problem at all, organized our rooms, but we're immediately glued to the news, the television news, CNN, you get in Egypt, CNN, BBC, all kinds of different stations, the local Egyptian stations, of course. Anyway, we're watching these protests really seriously escalating. The rest of our group is supposed to come on the next day, and now we're really concerned about the rest of the group because there's all of this stuff going on. Anyway, they get there the next day, and they're okay in terms of getting to Egypt, but they can't leave the airport because the whole thing is blocked off. They're worried about the protesters attacking the airport, and the roads now, it's a curfew. The roads are all shut. I'm not sure if I remember correctly if the internet and the cell phone service is shut down yet. Maybe it's the next day. Anyway, the rest of the group is stuck there, and then some of the group can't get there at all because they're caught in the blizzards that are raging in the Midwest. They can't get from the Midwest to Kennedy in order to get the plane, and those blizzards are going for a few days. So this is all chaos, and we, the 5 of us who were there already, 5 or 6 of us, are sitting in the Mina House at this great hotel, watching all of this going on and wondering if we're going to be able to do this trip. Meanwhile, the prostitutes of the media are having a ball. This is more fun than Tiger Woods' sex life or the Octomom or the death of Michael Jackson, at least for a few days. Doesn't have the longevity of Michael Jackson's death. But, I mean, it's only going to go on for a couple of weeks. But they're having a field day. I mean, all of this is chaos, and it's desperate. The government, the U.S. government, is telling all tourists to go home immediately. And our guys are stuck at the airport. Curfew is on. They can't get out of the airport. Eventually, we hear that my rep there, who's a very knowledgeable guy, has figured out a way to sneak our people out of the airport in a van with blacked out windows. So the authorities or the cops can't see that there are a bunch of tourists in there, because they are, of course, scared stiff that the tourists will get caught up in the melee, and that will be even more trouble for whatever's going on. My friend, our tour operator, Mohammed Nazmi of Quest Travel, is confident that we will be able to somehow or another manage, though it's now quite obvious that this is something serious going on, much more so than anyone would have anticipated, including ourselves. And now I have to say that for about 20 years, I've been telling people, it's not a bad idea to come to Egypt sooner rather than later, because sooner or later, this is a powder keg. Sooner or later, there has to be big problems in the Middle East. Actually, I've been surprised that it hasn't happened before now, but you couldn't put I could never put a time to it. I mean, I could never say, well, it's going to be this year or next year. And quite frankly, this took me to a certain extent by surprise. Not entirely, actually, because the Tunisia revolt had already happened, and the power of the internet to foment and to organize and to bypass the authorities, no matter what kind of bullshit they're talking about on their official or corporate-controlled media, you could get around that via the net, and that's only a fairly recent development. Anyway, Mohammed Nazmi, as we call the surgeon, because he knows how to operate. So he doesn't seem particularly concerned. And when our rep at the airport has snuck all of our people out and got them into a local hotel by the airport because the roads are all closed up and there are tanks all over the roads. So they're there for the night, but at least they're safe and they're out of the airport. So now we're watching all of this stuff going on, and there's a very surreal quality about it, because the palace part of the Mina House, where groups don't normally stay, the suites of the palace look like something out of a Cecil B. DeMille spectacular about the 1001 Nights. Most incredible suites in the world. This is mostly a dedicated group. It's a study group. I often do groups of Gurdjieffians or Theosophists, or in this case, a very interesting group called the Enneagram Institute, which is a teaching derived from the Gurdjieff Enneagram, as some of you or most of you or all of you may know by now. The Gurdjieff work is my own training. If it weren't for that, I wouldn't be able to function at all, I don't think. And Russ Hudson, who runs the group, can look it up, Enneagram Institute, ENNEAGRAM, EnneagramInstitute.com. And Russ is a good friend. He's been on a couple of trips with me already. And he's booked one of the suites at the Mina House. So we're at the suite, and when you're in a suite of this nature, the pyramids, you can see the pyramids lit up out the window, because it's a stone's throw away from the pyramids. And we're hanging out, drinking vodka, and a couple of people have brought a lot of champagne from the duty-free at the airport. So we're partying, watching all of this chaos going on, and waiting for or hoping for the rest of our group to show up. We're sitting there partying, and we have a nice supply of a certain kind of green tobacco to back up or amplify, let's say, the champagne and the vodka. And we're listening to all of this chaos going on CNN and NBC and so on. So anyway, eventually, the rest of the group meets us. A few people are stuck and can't get out at all out of America. One of our people is in the Navy, and the U.S. government has put part of his contract, he has to get home. I forget, it's a warning or something like that. Anyway, he has to turn around and get out of Cairo and get back to America. And somebody else, well, that's another day from now, is going to cancel out as well. So anyway, out of our 20, we've got 15 people. And now finally they managed to get to the Mina House as well. Now, internet's down, cell phones are down, the government is telling us we have to get home, and the U.S. government is going to fly us all back, or anyway, to Europe, and then we'll have to figure out a way to get back by ourselves. Everybody's supposed to get out instantly, and meanwhile, Cairo airport, we hear, is absolutely jammed with people. Thousands of people are in the airport. They can't get out. There's no food. There's no water. There are no beds. The planes are not flying. And we're sitting in the suite, smoking and having lots of vodka and champagne. We run out of champagne after a while, but anyway. So we're saying to ourselves, do we really want to do this? We're in one of the best hotels in the world. We're not in the protest. Nobody's after us. We're thinking maybe we'll see if we can sit this one out and see what happens. And there's a curious disconnect, because from our window we see the pyramids and you don't know that anything's going on. If you go out the front door of the Mina House, and it's all kind of gated in and enclosed, but if you look out to where you would normally exit, and there's a curfew now too, so we can't get out of the Mina House, at least not at night. And the entry into the hotel is blocked by a whole bunch of tanks and armored personnel carriers. So they're not aiming at us either. They're protecting us. So we're feeling pretty safe here. And so we have a meeting, and the general, everybody agrees that, well, let's wait it out and let's see what happens. In a worst case scenario, we're feeling pretty safe. We don't think anybody's after us, and sure enough, they're not. And we're reckoning that one way or another, in a worst case scenario, if all the sites are shut down and we can't go anywhere and carry on with our trip, well, we'll somehow find a way out. We'll be able to get to Israel, or we'll get a plane somewhere or another. And the government, meanwhile, our friendly government, has threatened all Americans come home immediately, or within 2 days, because at the end of 2 days, no more free rides to Europe or anything like that. Well, my rule number one for living safely and happily is to disregard anything that the government tells me I should do that's supposed to ensure my safety and happiness. So the fact that the government is telling us to get out is, for me, a very good reason to stay. And this is what we decide to do because, among other things, we don't want to be part of the thousands of people marooned at the airport waiting for planes to start flying again. And as I said, no internet, no cell phones, no communication, but we're at the Mina House. Everybody has left now, the Mina House. So this glorious hotel, we're the only people there. So we're stuck for a couple of days, and we can't, during the day, the curfew's off during the day, we can get out and go around, and Mohammed's office is, and he's got a couple of flats roughly around the corner, but there's nothing going on. And now, as you may remember, basically they're out to get Mubarak out of there. And the Mubarak forces, or what they say is the Mubarak forces, this is not, thugs, Mubarak, pro-Mubarak thugs, they're called. Well, they're not necessarily pro-Mubarak thugs. They're the camel drivers and the horse drivers from the Giza Plateau. And I don't think they care if Mubarak's in or out. But what the protests have done is instantly destroyed their livelihoods and the livelihoods of everybody who's dependent upon tourism for a living in Egypt, which is about 20% of the population. I mean, it's the second biggest source of hard income after the Suez Canal, and I think maybe third after remittances from Egyptians living abroad. But it's a big chunk of Egypt's livelihood. So the horse drivers and the camel drivers are furious because they're broke. The students have their own agenda, of course, and it's a legitimate enough agenda, except that it isn't. I'll get to this in a second. I mean, it's legitimate from one sense, but it's grievously misrepresented by the prostitutes and the media. Because they're talking about, they want self-determination and democracy and all of this stuff. Yeah, of course they want. It would be nice to have self-determination and democracy, but that's not really what is driving the Egyptian revolution or the one in Tunisia. And now they're exploding all over the place. And yeah, everyone is saying, it's jobs and it's the lack of opportunity and so on. But this has relatively little to do with autocratic governments. It has something to do with the grievous corruption at the top, which is not as bad as it is in America. I mean, the criminals at the top are not skimming off anything like the percentage of national wealth as the Wall Street criminals are skimming off of America. But nevertheless, all of this is happening. But the real force driving this revolution is basically jobs and the rising food prices, which is, again, in part due to Wall Street, to commodity traders jacking the prices up, taking advantage of massive droughts in Australia and floods, I forget where, but anyway, a big hit in the global food supply. So this combination is making it impossible for the vast majority of people at the bottom of the economic scale to even eat. As long as they're eating more or less, they really are not worried too much about democracy or autocracy or monarchy or whoever the hell is at the top. They just want to live their lives and be able to survive. So this is something that the press is misconstrued, and you have all of these pundits and political windbags talking about how wonderful that's the people after their self-determination and, finally the pro-democracy forces. Yeah, the pro-democracy forces because they want to get rid of a tyrant. Or anyway, on the tyrant scale, Mubarak is probably about 2 or 3 out of 10 compared to some of the other people. So yeah, sure, they want to get him out of there. That is not actually what is driving them. What is driving them is simply the inability to make a living, and for all of these young students who have an education, and the reason they have an education is because education is free in Egypt, and you don't have to take a student loan out for $250,000 to get a degree from Harvard or Princeton or Yale and then find that there's no job waiting for you. But there's still no job waiting for them. They've got their educations and they're angry. So all of this stuff is going on. And now 3 or 4 days pass. Fortunately, on this trip, we built enough time into it, had other things planned, that if we can get out of the Mina house, mind you, of all of the places in the world where you have to be quarantined or in solitary confinement, that's about as good as it gets. So after about 3 or 4 days, Egypt Air is flying again, and we can get out of Cairo and down to Luxor. So Mohammed manages to get tickets for us because there are only a couple of planes flying. So we head off very early in the morning because we don't know what we're going to find once we get to the airport. So now we're going through the back roads of Giza. Giza is not really a separate city. It's like the Bronx and Manhattan and Queens. It's really a borough of this gigantic city of 20 million people. And we're going down the back streets. It's still not clear, as far as I can tell, having followed this thing pretty closely, who emptied the prisons out. Presumably, it's the Mubarak forces of some sort or another, the idea being to turn these people loose. And, I mean, these are the hardcore criminals. They're not just in there for smoking a joint or two. And I don't know how many of them are political prisoners either. But they're a bunch of pretty rough dudes. And they're out to make a lot of trouble as much as they can. So they're looting and pillaging. They break into the Cairo Museum and do relatively little damage, but still they damage it and it gets a lot of press. And then they do go rampaging through the city, setting fire to various hotels and restaurants, and a lot of stores are shut down. And what happens, and this is the real upside to the revolution, the locals who are the ones who are being looted, band together in little vigilante committees and to stay up all night long at fires. It's cold there now. It's 45 or so degrees, and there are these little groups of young men, mostly armed with sticks and knives and the occasional antiquated rifle, guarding their own properties, their own little shops and vegetable stands and things from the looters. They've got the streets barricaded off with boulders. We're in our tourist bus with Quest Travel, big shiny bus, and they're all smiling at us. They're fine. They're not after us. They kind of appreciate that all the other tourists have fled and we're the only ones there. And so they're waving us back. They're moving the rocks away and sending us through with our bus. And eventually we get to the airport. And sure enough, we get on the plane. The airport's emptied out now. It's still got quite a few people in it, but it's not the chaotic, horrible scene that it was for a few days. So we're very pleased that we missed all of that. We know we're going to get to Luxor all right. And we hear that the temples, the sites themselves are open, or at least most of them are open. Anyway, we get to Luxor without any difficulty. And as it so happens, Mohammed owns a cruise boat called the Afandina. And now this is not a cruise boat like the normal ones that you see that have 50 or 60 cabins and they're big floating hotels on the Nile. There are something like 387 of those now, or 400. One of the reasons I stopped doing Nile cruises on my trips is that it's like a river version of the Los Angeles freeway with the boats tooting and going up and down all day long, and it's basically just destroyed the fun of that, what would otherwise be a wonderful Nile cruise. Muhammad's boat is a private yacht. It's something that's only started about 7 or 8 years ago, and they started building certain of these luxury private yachts that are the descendants of the ancient boats that the pharaohs used. They used to have a big square sail, two square sails actually, or just a rear sail as well, and a whole bunch of guys rowing, 25 banks or rows of oars on either side of the ship. When there was no wind, the boats would be rowed. Well, even nowadays, even though the Egypt wage scale is not that high, you can't afford 25, well, it would be 50 really, oarsmen to row the boat along. So if the wind isn't up, there's a little tugboat behind that pushes us up the river. And it only has 8 cabins. That means a total 16 people it can handle. And just a accident of fate, as it were, that 5 of our people had to leave. So instead of 20, we only have 15 now, and I make 16. And so we can fit in Mohammed's wonderful boat, which normally would cost $40,000 for the 15 of us for the week that we're going to be on it. And he had a group on it that had booked it, but they canceled out like everybody else. The whole tourist industry there for the moment is scuttled. So we have the boat at no extra cost. So this is, for me, I mean, this is maybe my 100th trip to Egypt, something like that. And much of my time and energy normally is spent avoiding the crowds, because in season, and really if you want to go in season because the summer is breathtaking hot, so a lot of my energy goes in figuring out ways to not get caught in the crush of tourists. We're pretty successful at this generally, but in order to do it, we have to get up at the crack of dawn, and sometimes we miss lunch to be at places over lunchtime, and I generally know exactly what's going to be crowded when. So we minimize the crowds, but still, they're crowds. And now suddenly, the first time, well, almost the first time, after the first Gulf War, we were there filming. Right after they shut it down, we were almost the first people back in Egypt. And that was something like this, except it wasn't a trip. It was, it was a filming trip. It was not a touring trip. So now we've got the river to ourselves. I mean, this is, nobody's experienced anything like this since 1850 or so, maybe during the Second World War or something like that. And then we go to the sites, and they're open, and there's just us, nobody else. Our little group of 15, a couple of times 1 or 2 people in one of the minor temples. One cruise boat heading the Nile in the other direction has 30 or 40 people, but otherwise we have it entirely to ourselves. And Mohammed, because he does know everybody and is very well connected, certain of the sites that would not otherwise be open, he gets opened. So we're only missing the museums. The wonderful Luxor Museum is shut because they're afraid of looters. And of course, back in Cairo, the Cairo Museum shut. And we can't get to Abydos and Dendera, which are high points on the trip. The temples are open, but they're afraid of letting people on the roads. So the roads are shut because they're afraid of looters and, bandits on the road. So we can't get there. But otherwise, we have it entirely to ourselves, and we are sailing up the sailing on the Afandina up the river to Philae Temple in Aswan, and then by private convoy to Abu Simbel. All of these places we have entirely to ourselves, which is miraculous. I mean, I'm a writer, so if I sit down, and I'm not putting it down, writing spontaneously as I'm doing now, I could probably find appropriate words, but nothing would really capture that experience, especially because if you read the early travelers, Florence Nightingale and Amelia Edwards and certain of the other writers of the 19th century who wrote very eloquently about it, they didn't have bathrooms and things like that, but basically they had Egypt to themselves too. And you get a glimpse of what Egypt was like when there was no tourism, but there were travelers who had the time and the money to be able to do that sort of a thing. So we're re-experiencing that, all of that in 5-star luxury, and enjoying it, every minute of it, and watching at night, glued to CNN and NBC and television and whatever newspaper reports are coming through, watching this whole thing escalate, and of course the back and forth, and there's a certain amount of violence going on, none of it directed at us, of course, and the tanks are in the streets, and eventually somewhere along the line the internet goes back on and the cell phones go back on, so there's communication, and I'm thinking anyway, that yeah, sure, for us it's great to have all of these places completely to ourselves, but it's also really pretty unnecessary because of the scare tactics. It's not that the revolution wasn't going on. It's going on, and people are getting hurt. But none of those people are tourists. A couple of them every once in a while, they rough up the journalists every once in a while for whoever it is that roughs them up. It's always said pro-Mubarak supporters. Maybe, maybe not. As you may remember, the American reaction to this was typically ambivalent. When it started, Joe Biden was trying to say that Mubarak wasn't a dictator. Of course he's a dictator. He's one party. It's as dictators go, as I said earlier. He's rather low on the dictator scale, and he, in fact, accomplished certain things while he was there that might not have been accomplished with free elections and lots of people arguing about doing what, and so on. I mean, in Egypt, for example, there are now 83 million people in Egypt, and until fairly recently, when the prices went high, almost nobody, through no fault of their own, almost nobody was hungry, and very few people were living on the streets. There were probably less homeless people in the whole of Egypt than there were in any middle-sized American city. Well, this was the upside of Islam, because that part of Egypt was socialist. The services, education was free, so lots of smart kids had educations that otherwise wouldn't have had them because they wouldn't have had the money to go there. So it was not as though this was not Stalin or Hitler at work. Yes, there was plenty of corruption at the top, just like here. The point I'm making is that the press, by concentrating entirely, 100%, on the violence, on the protests, and so on, scared everybody away. I mean, any good travel tour operator would have been able to do something similar to what we experienced. Maybe not, they wouldn't have had the wonderful Afandina, they wouldn't have had necessarily Muhammad's connections, but they didn't have to lose 100% of the income that would normally be coming in. Once the initial excitement was over, it would not have been terribly difficult to, well, maybe not get to every place, but not suddenly make a beeline out of the country and devastate this major industry when nobody was after us. See, this is the main point. Back in the last part of the 80s and the 90s, some of you may remember, there was a fundamentalist group, and it wasn't the Muslim Brotherhood, I don't believe. It was a much more radical fundamentalist group who wanted to take over the government, and it was deliberately targeting tourists. So there were a number of incidents, the worst of them being a real massacre at the Hatshepsut Temple in 97. And then the objective was, even then, they were after the tourists, but it wasn't because they hated tourists or because we were infidels. Rather, they calculated stupidly that if they killed some tourists and wrecked the economy, all of a sudden the Egyptian populace would be very happy to have them in charge. And of course, it was exactly the opposite. They destroyed the living for about a good chunk of the Egyptian people. And so finally, after the Hatshepsut incident, they called a moratorium on tourists, and it's more or less held for the next 13 years. So nobody was after us. And even back then, people used to say, "Oh, aren't you afraid?" Blah blah. And to me, it's a great mystery how people are incapable of looking rationally at a situation of this nature, because even when these things were going on and a couple of people were getting killed here and there, it was no worse or no more dangerous than walking down the streets of any American city, or let's say driving down the road. Now, you point this out to people. You're driving down the road, you see a smoking wreck, and the ambulances are there, and you look at it, and you see it just happened, and you say, gee, 5 minutes earlier, and it could have been me. But it wasn't you, so you just keep driving without thinking twice about it. Well, short of an all-out shooting war, I would not want to get parachuted into Afghanistan these days wearing my cowboy boots and waving an American flag. But otherwise, Mexico is a lot more danger than Egypt ever was. The horror stories coming out of Mexico with bandits and so on. And yet, the combination of the press and the American government, and the other governments too, scared everybody out of there. And much of it was unnecessary. Okay, some people are going to leave, but really, they're responsible for this huge exodus and the loss of all of this income when people were in no danger whatsoever, unless by some accident they got caught in a crossfire. Nobody was after them, and it was very easy to avoid the crossfires. You knew exactly where the protests were going on, so it was very easy to avoid the protests and at least get some of the trip in. Once they're gone, and who knows, refunds, no refunds, how long it takes to get the trip back together. Eventually, we get to see everything that we're getting to see. We fly back into Cairo. Things have simmered down. Let's see. Fly back into Cairo. Oh, yes, and Mubarak has not stepped down yet, so they're still shouting and screaming at Tahrir Square. And we have actually some really good compilation of this trip with us. We had a good friend of mine, not part of the Enneagram Institute, named Gary Abatelli, who's a famous photographer. He deliberately didn't bring all of his great equipment because he wanted to see Egypt through his own eyes rather than the camera. But once all of these things started going, he had a little camera with him, and he put together a wonderful, using footage. He went to Tahrir Square on the last day and had some adventures, but no danger, and put together this marvelous compilation of us at the sites, absolutely empty, and the hotels and the wonderful boat, and our very interesting-looking group of people, and then interspersed with the protests and the tanks on the streets and all of this. It makes for a very vivid and highly professionally orchestrated recap of our five-star experience. And we got back to Cairo, and I think Zahi Hawass opened, a good friend of Muhammad's, opened up the Giza Plateau, especially for us anyway. There was nobody there, so us completely alone by the pyramids. And then the next day at Saqqara, completely alone at Saqqara. Then Mubarak stepped down. It was time to leave. But the airport workers were on strike, so tough for us. We had to spend an extra day at the Mina House again. By now, we've run out of vodka and champagne, but nevertheless, we're still enjoying ourselves pretty well. And watching all of this unfold, and so that was our experience. But then now a word that doesn't come out if you've been following this stuff and what applies to Egypt. Each of these Middle East countries are individual and they're different, and they have different problems. Each one has its own unique problems, but they have certain things in common. And one of the things they have in common is the basic economic factor. So do not believe a lot of what you read about this thirst for democracy and the wanting a say in what's going on and so on. Guaranteed, if everybody had jobs and the money was distributed relatively equitably, which it isn't, except nowhere as it is inequitable as in America these days. Good stats on that, actually. Some very interesting work done on that score. If everybody is doing okay and they don't have to be rich, but they've got jobs and they've got incomes coming in, nobody's going to make a fuss whether it's autocracy or monarchy or oligarchy or anarchy, whatever it is. Nobody actually, or very few, actually give a damn. People just want to lead their own lives in dignity and with enough to sustain them. They're not even greedy. They don't need to be Jamie Dimon or Paulson or Geithner or any of these vampires that are robbing America blind. But the point is that, and I will get into this in the second part of this PhoenixFire 10, because in Egypt, everybody is celebrating. In Tunisia, I guess they are too. But really, Hillary and Barack are mouthing pious sentiments about what a great opportunity this is for the Egyptian people, and they've overthrown the yoke of autocracy and all of this crap. They have overthrown the yoke of autocracy up to a point, because the army has now taken over, and the army at the moment is the people trust more than they did. Anyway, they were tired of Mubarak after 30 years. But it remains to be seen if the military actually cedes control to a civilian government. And even if they do, this is the problem. Egypt is a country, it's a big country, but only the little percentage of it, 5% or something like that, is arable. Egypt would support 25 million people comfortably. 50 million people maybe tolerably, but it's bulging at the seams. 83 million and counting, it cannot support. There is no possible way in which there are jobs for 83 million people, or the money to go around, or any way to sustain 83 million people. So the point here is that no matter who gets in, and if it's a democracy, if everybody is arguing about what to do, and nobody can really do very much, which is fairly typical of most democracies, it can only be a matter of time before the honeymoon ends. And then who knows? And the same applies to a lesser extent or a different extent in all of the different Middle Eastern countries. And I'll get into this when I talk about the work that I've been doing with Jerry Salente. It's Gerald Salente, I call him Jerry, but it's Gerald to everyone else, and the trends stuff, because we see very extraordinary times coming up. So anyway, we have to wait an extra day at the Mina House before we get back to America. And then meanwhile, actually, we've been front page news in certain of the Arab papers, because Arabic-speaking Egyptian papers, because we're the only tourists in Egypt. And believe me, it's not to be believed what that experience is like. So closing this third of the talk here, I'd like to say that having foreseen something coming up somewhere along the line, frankly, I thought it was going to happen before this, but when it did happen, I wasn't quite ready for it now. In other words, I thought Mubarak had enough of a grip on it so that somehow or another it would not have been as abrupt as it was. And the reason that it was so abrupt was not just that people were genuinely fed up and not being able to afford food, but that the internet and YouTube and Twitter and all of these galvanizing forces allowed people to circumvent the otherwise government-controlled media. And the same applies to America, where it's not government-controlled, it's corporate-controlled. But since the corporations control the government, it might as well be government-controlled. Egypt isn't anywhere near as unbalanced as that under a dictator. So you pay your money and you take your choice. Big deal. In Egypt, you got thrown in jail and tortured for saying anything against the government. This is true. This is not a nice thing to do. In America, still, you can say anything that you want because no one listens. They don't care. And in fact, that situation is encapsulated in a single word by one of my favorite ex-vice presidents, Dick Cheney, who, when it was pointed out to him at some point, and I don't have the exact date for this, when it was pointed out to him that the polls showed strongly against continuing the war in Iraq, Dick Cheney's answer was, so? So there you have the value of free speech in America, in a single word, by one of America's most interesting vice presidents. Anyway, one of the points I'm driving at here with this long recount or recapitulation is that Egypt has a honeymoon of certainly at least a year, maybe up to 2 years before the shit hits the fan, before it's understood that Mubarak was not the problem himself, And even the gang of thieves he had assembled around him was not the big problem. The big problem is 83 million people in a country that cannot comfortably handle more than 50 million. And so almost inconceivable that there won't be more trouble, maybe much worse trouble. So that said, Egypt has a honeymoon of certainly at least a year, maybe up to 2 years before the shit hits the fan, before it's understood that Mubarak was not the problem himself, and even the gang of thieves he had assembled around him. Big problem is 83 million people in a country that cannot comfortably handle more than 50 million. And so almost inconceivable that there won't be more trouble, maybe much worse trouble. So that said, I had a trip, one of my standard Egypt trips, scheduled for the early April, first week of April, the usual trip. They canceled out. So I'm looking to see if I can gather enough people. I need 12 to put it back in action again. And the carrot is that Egypt is quiet now, almost certainly will be quiet for a while, but by April it will be still almost empty. And as I hope I made plain before, experiencing Egypt empty is an experience of a lifetime, really. So anybody listening to this, and tell your friends, and I'll be posting it up on various websites, Hancock's website, and a number of other places where I have a voice, to see if I can get this trip together again. Anybody interested, my website's jawest.com, and you'll find it won't be this particular trip on there, but if you click on Magical Egypt Tours, you'll see what's involved. Probably the same price as the one listed, maybe a bit more because prices go up. Anybody interested, my email is there as well. And get in touch, and if we can put together an April trip, I'm game to do it.
PhoenixFire.
Okay, actually, the trip was scheduled originally for the 27th of January to the 12th of February, and we had to stay an extra day, so it was from the 27th to the 13th, and of course we lost a few days being quarantined at the Mina house and so on. But basically, everybody on the trip really appreciated this experience. And then finally, Mubarak was out, big celebrations, and the drive out to the airport was actually very different from the drive that we had initially experienced when we got out of the Mina house to go to the airport to go to Luxor, because then we were on these back streets where the looters had just been, and early in the morning, everything's smoky and kind of spectral looking. These little bunches of young men with their sticks and their kitchen knives and their ancient rifles examining our tour bus, giving us a pass, pulling away the rocks that they'd barricaded the road with, and making our way very, very slowly out to the airport. By the way, I should reinforce that. People say, oh, yes, they have their difficulties. No, it's not that they have their difficulties. It is practically impossible. If they elected Muhammad himself as the Muhammad himself as their next president, with Jesus as his vice president, there's practically nothing that could be done. And actually that's not what you hear on CNN or NBC. They're talking about blather about democracy and so on. None of this is consequential, actually. And on the road itself, there's a big ring road that opened not too long ago that leads from Giza near the Mina house out to the airport, which allows you to circumvent the chaos of driving through Cairo, which is a nightmare. And the ring road itself is, I don't know, maybe 6 lanes wide, but Egyptian drivers turned it into 8 lanes. That road in and of itself is a lesson in why whatever anybody tries to do with the best will in the world, short of something miraculous, and me being me, I do not necessarily discount miracles, but you get it both ways. You drive from the airport, you get it from one direction, you drive out. Egypt seems to be entirely under construction of the worst kind of cheapest, it looks like low-income housing but chaotic low-income housing. And it isn't really, it's all private. It looks as though it's government, horrible, ugly things. Mile after mile of these things that are semi-occupied or not occupied at all. And there's just miles of this chaos. And then in between, there are areas of slum that are hard to imagine. I've never been to Calcutta, but it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine anything worse than these tenements with alleys between them. I mean, not enough to drive, barely enough to get a motorcycle down them. A few feet between these buildings, 4, 5, 6 stories high, with horrible, dirty laundry hanging from the balconies or out of the windows. What these must be like in the Egyptian summer, I have no idea. No services, trash on the streets. This is unfixable. And then in certain areas on the way out, on the other side of the road that you can't get across because the traffic is streaming down it and there are no underpasses or overpasses or lights, you take your life in your hands, or they take their lives in their hands to try and get across the street, if they try to get across. On the other side, here and there, spotted along, are these gated communities, or the equivalent of gated communities for the super wealthy, of some of the ugliest McMansions that I have ever seen in my life. They make Donald Trump look like Frank Lloyd Wright. Never have I seen such hideous buildings. When you compare slums, endless construction, but nonstop. I mean, this has taken up all sorts of farmland. What was farmland 20, 30 years ago? You get a sense of the impossibility of doing anything really with this country full of, for the most part, lovely people. And it's horrible. It's moving and it's horrible. And it's not what you get from the prostitutes who are talking blather about democracy and all the rest. And then, yes, well, of course, Egypt has its problems. No, it doesn't have its problems. It's probably unfixable. For our purposes, I mean, nothing we can do to fix it. For those who want to see, who want to experience ancient Egypt, which is, it's actually the only real civilization worthy of its name, of the name of civilization, that you can actually still visit and get a sense of. In other words, elsewhere there are plenty of wonderful sacred architecture around the world, but not enough left of anything. Gothic cathedrals, wonderful Islamic mosques, Indian temples, but nothing where you go day after day after day, particularly when there are no people there, and you get a sense of what people who understood what being a human being was really all about did with their lives. And the contrast between that, and not just the horror of poverty-stricken modern Egypt, but the, in a way, even worse horror of shiny Wall Street, the technological, what is laughingly called progress. It's only in Egypt where you can get this sense of what life on Earth used to be like for civilized people. There's no particular reason why, let's say, in principle, with that understanding, something of that nature couldn't be reformulated in a manner, let's say, commensurate to our 21st century. So it's not just the romantic trip into the past, it's a teaching lesson. So the Egypt trip over, experience of a lifetime, for everybody, actually. Everybody writes me in now, a week after we get back, telling me how amazing it's been and how they're the life of the party, recounting what happened. The rest for us is getting to the airport. This time, no more vigilantes on the street, no more rocks blocking the roads. People actually hard at work cleaning up the garbage, and actually I suspect they'll get the garbage cleaned up pretty nicely before reality sets back in, or the new reality sets back in. We get to the airport, no problem at all. Everything, now it's normal airport chaos, and we get on our plane, and back we go to JFK, trip over. That's my version of the 5-star revolution. Again, plugging for my trips. Not only is it a way of paying the mortgage, but it is a way of introducing people, and nothing can do that the way that a trip does, actually, like can quote myself. George Bernard Shaw always used to say, I always quote myself, despises the conversation. Egypt is like sex. Now, why is Egypt like sex? Because you can read all about it and you can look at pretty pictures. Although that's interesting, but until you've actually experienced it, you don't know anything about it.
PhoenixFire.
Surprise! Until we find sponsors for our dedicated ad space, it's still John Anthony West, here to tell you about my personally guided magical Egypt tours. There's a fascination about Egypt, a glamour, a romance. On my trips, people tell me they've been dreaming of traveling to Egypt since early childhood. There are other wonderful sacred places in the world, Gothic cathedrals, Mayan pyramids, Islamic mosques, Hindu and Buddhist temples. But there is nothing anywhere that matches the grandeur, power, and perfection of Egypt. Yet unless you see Egypt through symbolist eyes, you've not seen Egypt at all. For it is only the symbolist interpretation developed by the brilliant philosopher, mathematician, and alchemist R.A. Shvalad that makes sense of the Egyptian experience. Where establishment academics see only a bizarre, architecturally accomplished but still primitive civilization, Shvala saw and proved that it was based upon a profound and sophisticated sacred science, a science of cosmic principles. One wonders how people come back from Egypt and live lives the way they lived them before, wrote Florence Nightingale back in 1850. The answer is, they don't. 2 weeks in Egypt and you will understand the difference, finally, between true civilization and progress. For detailed information, see my website, jawest.net. Click on Magical Egypt Tours. These are one-of-a-kind trips. There is nothing like them. We find ways to avoid crowds. We meditate in the Great Pyramid. We get into places other people don't get into. The food is great. So are the hotels. The price is remarkably competitive. Just remember, if you don't see Egypt through symbolist eyes, you don't see Egypt at all.
PhoenixFire.
Welcome back to PhoenixFire 10. I was talking about the reason why I was even later than usual getting around to PhoenixFire 10 was the concentrated work that I'm doing, taking up most of my time, with my friend Gerald Celente and his Trends Research Institute. To recapitulate, we co-wrote a book called Trends 2000 in the 90s. An interesting book, actually. In retrospect, we were right on the money for the most part. Many of the things people were laughing at us, sneering and saying, oh, this can't happen, because some of the scenarios we were painting were not what people wanted to hear. But now it's taken longer in certain cases for them to manifest, but now they are manifesting big time. And that book actually, interesting, should have been a bestseller, and it didn't happen. It was sabotaged by our own publisher, who couldn't stand Gerald. We changed editors in the middle. Unbelievable. They managed to keep the book deliberately out of the bookstores so that when he had these shots of wonderful publicity, there were no books to buy. Did quite well, actually, but not what it should have done. And anyway, off and on over the years, I've been working with Celente. And then, as I mentioned, over the last couple of years, he's basically called it. When everybody was saying Bernanke and all of these schmucks were talking about the housing market is going to rise forever and there's never going to be another depression or a serious recession, Celente was long ago saying that no, it's a bubble, it's going to bust, and there's going to be hell to pay. He was absolutely dead right. The work we do together is actually, it's very interesting as far as I'm concerned, or I wouldn't be doing it. And it is very prescient. Jerry Celente he's the most unlikely psychic that you've ever imagined. And he didn't like me to say that he's psychic, but It's something like that. He connects the dots in 3 dimensions. He reads voluminously, and he picks out what's valid. I mean, there's this overwhelm of information out there. I mean, we co-write this thing with a few other very interesting contributors chiming in, actually. And as we're building, we're acquiring more really good people to contribute from their own fields of expertise, science and energy and so on. And we put out, or it's Gerald's actually, the Trends Journal. Google up Trends Journal. You'll find all of the links. We called all of this stuff going on. He called actually all of this unrest in the Middle East well before it happened. And he sees this whole thing. In other words, what I want to say here is don't believe the baloney that you read in the general media and on the business in the financial papers about a recovery. There is no recovery. It's a fraud. It's a cover-up, not a recovery. The unemployment figures and the housing markets tell the tale. The stock market is going bananas because a bunch of gamblers are actually profiting on the misery of others for a while until that implodes. And there's much worse coming up. If you want to keep informed of what's going on, it is not a bad idea to get a subscription to the Trends Journal. Every day we get dozens of letters, emails coming in saying thanks for somebody actually with the nerve to tell it like it is. Salente calls himself, it's a good line, a political atheist, and so he is. I mean, he doesn't buy the baloney from either side. Actually, he calls it a two-headed one-party system, which describes it pretty well. It's the two heads talk to each other and think that there's a democracy going on, but they're basically the same, and you can see that actually in the Obama record. Who's next when he runs for re-election? Maybe his slogan this time will be no change you can believe in, because it's hard to imagine that he could have done less. And even to this day, supporters who we call Obama apologists are insisting that somebody's holding a gun to his head, or that he has to do what he's doing, and they're still making excuses for this guy who actually rode to power on a wave of enthusiasm where allowing that there are certain constraints and that once you're in power, it's very difficult to live up to all of your promises. He will go down in history as the biggest disappointment in American politics, probably. Anyway, it's interesting because Salente is truly a political atheist. The liberals absolutely shun him like the plague. He cannot get any traction from them. And oddly enough, the right wing, who was really after him, I mean, when he was calling for trying George W. Bush as a war criminal, even before the Iraq War, or just as the Iraq War was starting. So the conservatives didn't want to hear that. And he's still saying exactly the same thing. Oddly enough, Fox, which is put a different spin on the words fair and balanced, has him on often on Fox News and Happy Hour and a couple of other things. But really, we really should have our own venue and our own TV show, actually, on a daily basis, because the Trends Journal is extremely time-consuming to write, and we'd love to be able to get this out to lots more people. We have a pretty big audience as it is, but what we are saying, the combination of my Egypt philosophy, history, literary past, and Salente's ability to connect those dots in 3 dimensions is a pretty unique production. It's a journal, so it's history in the making and relatively compressed. So it's not as though you're reading a 500-page book to find out what's going on. And as I said, a tremendous amount of research goes into it. See for yourselves, because almost nobody is making the forecast that we're making, and we have a track record that I don't think anybody else can match. And even now, there are a number of people who see the economic bad times coming up, and who are watching these revolutions going on, sweeping across the world, but they're not connecting those dots the way we are, because, to put it bluntly, the way we see the dots connected is that sooner or later this has to lead, and is leading, to the first great war of the 21st century. We back it up. This is not scare tactics. It's very hard to acknowledge what's going on and avoid the consequences of what's going on. So see for yourself. But in any event, as I said earlier, one of the reasons why I'm so late in getting PhoenixFire 10 out there is because I have been doing this work with Solente, and I feel the combination of the ancient wisdom and being on top of what's happening now. I mean, anybody who thinks this is going to smooth over somehow or another and it's going to be back to normal is living in a state of terrible delusion. To survive what's coming up is going to take a considerable amount of foresight. And depending, everybody's situation is different. If you live in the city, it's one thing. If you live in the country, it's another. If you're rich, obviously, that takes a lot of the burden off. Even if you're strapped for cash, if you're unemployed, that's another thing. It has to be a cold look at what's coming up. We feel, as Solente puts it, you prepare for the worst, but plan for the best. But if you pull up Gerald Solente on YouTube, you'll find him lots of TV and audio clips. Google it up, you'll find it.
PhoenixFire.
Magical Egypt, a symbolist tour in DVD and more besides. If you can't take a trip to Egypt and experience it firsthand, well, you can't. Not everyone can, but next best and the closest you can get to experiencing Egypt is our 8-episode documentary series, Magical Egypt, a Symbolist Tour. This is the brainchild of my partner, Chance Gardner, a graphic designer and 3D animator of genius, and this series is an absolutely unique visual, emotional, and intellectual media experience. There are innumerable documentaries about Egypt, dry as dust, misleading, repetitive exercises in Egyptological establishmentarianism from the National Geographic or Discovery Channel or some other wielder of the academic cookie cutter. Pretty pictures, nothing ever that feeds the mind, the heart, to say nothing of the soul. This series fills that gap. We explore Egypt in depth. We follow the ramifications into alchemy, the tarot deck, modern DNA research, sacred geometry, the mysteries of ancient technology. There are interviews with leading-edge scholars, scientists and thinkers, each contributing to a radical revision of our understanding of the past. For more information, go to www.magicalegypt.com and more. If you've not read My Serpent in the Sky, The High Wisdom of Ancient Egypt, maybe it's time you did. An in-depth introduction to Shwala de Lubitsch's symbolist interpretation. Our Emmy Award-winning classic documentary, Mystery of the Sphinx, now available in an upgraded DVD version. My guidebook, Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt, an invaluable source of information for armchair and actual travelers to Egypt. I have a few copies of my out-of-print first non-fiction book, The Case for Astrology, left for sale. See my website, www.jawest.net. Click on Books.
PhoenixFire.
Welcome back to part 3. Now, this may seem a bit disjointed, but in fact, the 3 parts of this long diversion from the 4 cowboys of the apocalypse are to a considerable extent interconnected. So this next part is actually, call it Zep Tepe, Gobekli Tepe, the Great Sphinx, and Gold. I will explain why it's called that. Lots and lots of people have been asking us for years, myself and the people who work with me, Robert Chalk and so on, when are we going to do the follow-up for our Mystery of the Sphinx, which was back in 93, and as some of you know, or lots of you probably know well, it's a whole generation since then. So many of you probably have not actually seen our video, which was a runaway success in its day. Millions of people saw it. Many millions of people saw it. I won an Emmy for it. It was nominated for Best Documentary of 93. And unfortunately, my criminal partner, now deceased, stole $150,000 from the till and made a lot of trouble all along the way, and so it never really generated anything further. And then we were prevented from doing further research in Egypt, which we'd hoped to do. And so it has limped along all of these years with us intending to do a follow-up, but needing something spectacular enough, a hook in television terms. Nowadays, actually, there are ways around this. You don't actually have to depend upon the big flat screen anymore to get something out there. You can do it purely by internet, but still it's nice to be able to access that big screen, and it's still very considerable audience. So we needed the hook. And for years, again, anybody who's following the story will know that for quite a number of years, we were thinking of putting together a panel of geologists to concentrate on this question of water weathering once and for all, because we've basically been stymied by the quackademic community over these years, the argument being not so much opposed to the geology, not as if they knew anything about it, the Egyptologists and the archaeologists, but it was impossible for the Sphinx to be dated from the time we were provisionally dating it, because it was all hunter-gatherers back then, and the hell with the geology. It was impossible that something of the Sphinx's magnitude could be produced at that kind of a time. And so our plan was to circumvent that argument, but simply go after the water weathering and to put a panel together, a panel of geologists who agreed with us or were at least open to the possibility, and a panel chosen by Zahi Hawass or whoever, the loyal opposition as it were, of opposing geologists, and get them over there for a couple of weeks to duke it out. Well, we never did this, partly because it was time-consuming and expensive. And though Zahi said he thought it was a good idea, it was just the prospect of, was he going to make trouble about this? He did say, well, as long as everybody's credentials are okay, yes, I'd be very interested in that. Anyway, we didn't quite trust it, and there was a lot of work, and even more to the point, from Shark's point of view, it was unnecessary. It's proved as far as we're concerned, and so it was more of a PR stunt than it was actually carrying the science further. Anyway, we didn't do it. Then along came, a few years ago, we were made aware of a site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, which is southeastern Turkey, not too far from the border of Syria, a few hundred miles from Egypt, actually. Once we started studying this and reading the reports on it, this was our smoking gun. We needed a smoking gun, and we've been disappointed on a few occasions. Some of you will know about our dives on this island called Yonaguni off the coast of Japan, which looks like an underwater structure, but we, Shock and myself, especially Shock, determined to our own satisfaction that it was entirely natural and was not the smoking gun that we were looking for. And there were a number of other false leads that we hoped would be the evidence that we were looking for. In other words, something else that was inescapably artificial, man-made, in other words, whether underwater or on dry land, but something that could be dated back around 10,000 years ago or more, that would serve as an argument against, it's all hunter-gatherers back then. When we read about Göbekli Tepe, this seemed to be the smoking gun. It's a long story, but if you Google it up, you'll find a fair amount of information on it. You spell it, I'll have that in the show notes, actually, so don't worry about how you spell it. It was discovered accidentally in 94 maybe, when a farmer plowing the top of a field, hit what he thought was a boulder under the earth, and he ran the plow back over it a couple of times and couldn't dislodge it. So he started digging around it, and he kept digging, and he kept digging, and he kept digging, and he kept digging, and found that actually he had uncovered the top of a massive stone pillar. And at some certain point, he called the archaeologists in, and they started excavating very, very carefully and doing ground-penetrating radar and seismographs, I think. They discovered this incredible site called Göbekli Tepe, which has been only in the ensuing 13 years carefully and meticulously excavated. And what they've found so far, and even the 5% isn't fully excavated because excavation is a very slow and expensive process, and it's all under the direction of an excellent and very meticulous German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt. What they've discovered so far is 5 stone circles like mini Stonehenges, but not that many. 2 central pillars, T-shaped pillars in each of these stone circles, surrounded by 2 concentric rings of smaller circles. The massive stone pillars in the center weigh around 15 tons each. They're 12, 15 feet high. So this is no fooling around. This is big megalithic construction. The pillars are also elegantly, brilliantly, exquisitely carved with animals and birds and insects and all kinds of symbolic figures, not writing as such as we know it. The 5% is excavated, and the other 95%, they know on ground-penetrating radar, are still more of these amazing stone circles, at least 22 more of them, if I have the figures right. Or maybe it's 22 altogether and 18 more still to be uncovered. So this is going to take a long time. Now, there are no signs of habitations around this hill. I mean, the hill is artificial. There are no signs of houses or anything of the sort. There are no signs of the kinds of tools that you would expect to work stone into these exquisite, not deep reliefs, they're raised reliefs. In other words, you have to carve away the surface of the pillar in order to free the stone lion or the stone fox or the stone crane, whatever it is, from the rock. So nothing has been discovered on site that would seem to be adequate to produce these amazing structures. Perhaps one of the most interesting and intriguing aspects of Göbekli Tepe is that it was at some point deliberately covered over, very carefully, massively. I mean, this is a big site, acres of it, and it was deliberately covered over, and the fill that covered it over has been dated to around 8000 BC, meaning, according to Schmidt, that Göbekli Tepe itself must date, and the argument for it is solid. Shock and I, and Shock's wife, and a good Turkish friend, Dr. Melarici, we all went last May to Göbekli Tepe to meet Schmidt and to check it out for ourselves because, as I've said, we've got burnt by what we hoped would be smoking gun evidence before, which turned out not to be. Anyway, we went there, met Schmidt, who's a very personable and careful worker, and he dates Göbekli Tepe. And remember, he is a German archaeologist, traditional, not New Age, alternative symbolist like myself, and now Shock, who's gotten pretty symbolist in his own right. And he dates Göbekli Tepe no later than 10,000 BC. So that is our smoking gun. I mean, this is, even the archaeological community is not arguing with him. So what this means for our Sphinx theory is that the argument that it's all hunter-gatherers back then can no longer be used. Or rather, you can say that maybe they were hunter-gatherers, but they were hunter-gatherers capable of putting up stone circles with central pillars that weigh 15 tons that they've had to quarry out of the rock about a mile away and bring it uphill to erect it in place and carve it with all of these extraordinary animals and birds and figures and motifs and all kinds of things. If you Google it up, you'll find it. So this was our smoking gun. Now we're prepared to do our follow-up, what between us, we call Son of Mystery of the Sphinx. But we will not call it Son of Mystery of the Sphinx. We will probably call it Zep Tepe, Göbekli Tepe, the Sphinx, and gold. Anyway, at least Zep Tepe, Göbekli Tepe, and the Sphinx. The reason for that I'll explain in a second, because in Turkish, certain of the journalists say, well, it means Potbelly Hill, or they kind of make a joke of it. It means Belly Hill. Well, actually, it doesn't mean that at all. It actually means the navel of the world. In other words, it's a place, it's cosmological, and it is somehow or another, and we don't understand what these figures mean ourselves. We think, Shock and myself, that they're astronomical, astrological, cosmological, in some combination, but we don't have the clue to it either. But certain of the artifacts that have been found at the site, sculptures and so on, have this theme of birth, coming forth into the world, possibly even the creation of the world itself. Now, in the ancient Egyptian, Zeptepe means the first time, and there may be language correspondence between Turkish and ancient Egyptian. I mean, this is not my field of expertise, I can't say, but Laird Scranton, whose work some of you will know, and if you don't, you should know it. You want to look up Laird's work on ancient cosmology and the relationships between the Egyptians and the ancient Dogon, and then by extension with all kinds of other ancient cultures where cosmology is central to practically all of the ancient cultures, but it's a cosmology that is in fact consonant with the latest wrinkles in string and torsion theory and quantum mechanics and so on. In other words, what we know, they knew way back when, even when they were supposedly hunter-gatherers. Laird's name is Laird, Scranton, like Scranton, Pennsylvania, Scranton. You'll find his work. It's very important, we feel, and absolutely in keeping and consonant with the work we've been doing. Anyway, Zeptepe in ancient Egyptian means the first time, which may refer to the first civilization, but may also refer to, or maybe more to the point, refer to the first time when there was any time. The ancient myths, ancient esoteric legends and myths often refer to the time before there was any time. If you get into this sort of study, you find that time is itself relative, not in the Einsteinian sense, but it's an artifact of creation. Before there is creation, there is no time, as it were. Time, as we understand it, is dependent upon there being creation. Makes sense, actually, if you figure it out. If you start thinking about it too much, all of a sudden you don't see why it is so obvious, but it is. So Zeptepe may refer to the first civilization and or refer to the first act of creation. Of course, it's no longer possible to say that our argument for the Sphinx can be dismissed because it's all hunter-gatherers back then, and how could hunter-gatherers produce something as fantastic as the Sphinx and the temple around it? That argument is gone now, and the geology, we are absolutely certain, cannot be challenged. So now we're planning on doing our follow-up video. We hope it'll be part of a series that gets back into at least a program or two on the pyramids, and because now there's a lot of very interesting work coming out decoding the template upon which the whole Giza Plateau is laid out. All of a sudden, there's really breakthrough scholarship being done in this field. And interestingly enough, whereas for the first mystery of the Sphinx, it was a nightmare getting the finance together, now we have at least a good chunk of the finance together. The way this happened is rather interesting, and I will detail the story a bit because it may be of practical interest to some of the people who will be accessing this blog.
PhoenixFire.
All right, so here's the story of our new sponsorship and where it's leading for our Son of Mystery of the Sphinx, which we're actually calling Zeptepe, which means the first time. It's the ancient Egyptian words meaning the first time, which by some is taken to be cosmological, the first time that there was time, let's say, where the absolute consciousness manifests. Our film is going to be called Zeptepe, and we don't have the subtitle quite yet, but it'll be a combination of Egypt, the Sphinx, and this wonderful find, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Anyway, this is a friend of mine who was on a trip back in the early 90s, and he was deep into research in ancient civilizations, especially catastrophe theory and the nature of the catastrophe. And he was the adopted son of a spiritual leader who was running the trip. My friend, and I can't reveal his name at the moment, I'll tell you why in a little bit. It's nothing really hush-hush and secret. It's a strictly business thing. He was the admin guy. He did all of the organization for his adopted father. And then his father died fairly young in the middle 90s. I lost track of my friend. Years later, it was a couple of years ago, he decided to come on another trip, got back in touch, and then he had this story to tell that when his adopted father died, he'd made his whole living running the organization for his father. Now he suddenly had to, father didn't leave any money to speak of, he had to go out and make a living, and went into business, several different businesses over the next dozen years or so, and found out that he was pretty good at it. And at the end of a dozen years or so, since business wasn't what he really wanted to do, he sold out for a few $1 million and retired, effectively young, age 50 or so, intending to put his money where his interests were, and came on the second trip. He'd invested a bunch of his money, and he came on the second trip, and over the course of his conversation said, well, he really was interested in supporting our work, my work I do with Robert Schock, and was very interested in financing us. So needless to say, I didn't say, well, go back where you came from. I said, that's very welcome. And then the story unfolded as to where the money was coming from, and a side of his nature that I absolutely had no sense of. He's a laid-back, blonde guy, very Californian in attitude. You wouldn't see this streak of him and just hanging out with him. He's a bonsai expert. He studied in Japan for several years doing bonsai and teaches it, and is also a very high-level practitioner in Tai Chi, which is not what you'd normally expect from a business guy. But anyway, he told me about these various investments that he had made, which would be providing us with a chunk of our financing for the film. And one of them was, he had a good chunk of money in a treasure hunt. A man named Mel Fisher, who in the 70s discovered in the Caribbean somewhere a treasure ship with a few $100 million worth of gold and silver on it, and he's been treasure hunting ever since, and has zeroed in on another one, anyway, the general area. And this one has an even bigger payback. They know about these things because they're in the Admiralty records. If they find this one, the payback will be a couple of billion, I think, anyway, over $1 billion. And my friend has a chunk of it. So if they find it over the next few years, it's a few more million for him. But it's the second investment that really intrigued me. This was shares in the reopening of the great Comstock lode. This was arguably the most important, the richest of the American gold rush stories. It's not that well known. I mean, you associate gold rush with California in 49. It was a minor 49er. And the Yukon around the turn of the century, the Klondike. And the Comstock isn't that well known, but it's actually a richer lode. And in fact, they didn't stop mining it because it ran out of gold and silver. They stopped mining it because they ran out of technology. The technology wasn't good enough to keep mining under very dangerous and difficult conditions. So they stopped. And then for over 100 years, they stopped around 1900. Oh, sidelight, very interesting sidelight for me as a writer. And that is that it was at the Comstock that Mark Twain actually got his start. He was an unsuccessful prospector, but started writing for the local paper, Sentinel, I think it was Virginia City Sentinel, I believe, and found out that after all, he had a bit of talent for writing. So it was the Comstock that actually set him into motion along his career. Anyway, my friend had found out about this place. An interesting man named John Winfield, very wealthy man, who started buying up land in the Comstock. It was in Nevada. And his original notion, as I understand it, was to set up not to go into mining, but to set up a refuge for wild mustangs, which is an unusual thing for a very wealthy man to do. Usually very wealthy people are out to shoot mustangs if they can, or shoot anything else, but not this fellow, not Winfield. And then somewhere along the line, he understood that there was a lot of gold and silver still underground, but the land was all tied up with conflicting claims. For 100 years, there have been lawsuits of everybody suing everybody else. And he started buying up the claims when they were contested. Anyway, he ended up with most of the claims bought, and then set out to open up the mine again, now with much advanced technology, and of course with gold and silver both going sky high in value. And my friend bought in for a big chunk of shares, well over $1 million in shares that he bought at $1 something. And the reason I can't divulge his name actually is because he's what's called a preferred shareholder, and for some reason or another, they're not supposed to divulge their names to people for a period of time, which I don't know what that is. But anyway, you just have to take it on trust. Anyway, he started telling me about this, and even just the tailings from the old mine had enough gold and silver left in them to produce really, many, many millions of dollars worth of gold and silver without even further mining. And then the big thing was that if they discovered further bonanzas, a bonanza, by the way, is a technical term for a particularly rich vein. I forget what it is exactly. It has X number of ounces per ton of ore. If it's whatever over that, that's a bonanza. Look it up. I forget what it is. Anyhow, if they found more of it, in other words, the stock that he bought at 120 should, things being equal, be at 8 or 10 within a couple of years, but over a year's already gone by. If they discover bonanzas, the thing could go sky high, 100 times its price, and then one of the big guys comes around and buys it out, and anybody who's got a bit of money put into it can do very well indeed. So when my friend told me that, I basically said, well, how do you get into this? Because my own situation over the last couple of years, as I've explained earlier in this blog, working with my pal Gerald Salente and the Trends Journal, is, I think for the first time that I can remember, I'm not absolutely flat broke wondering where the mortgage is coming from. I don't have anything extra, but I had enough to put a few thousand into the Comstock. I bought in about 160, and now 320. It's been up to 4, but it could go skyrocketing because they're always discovering new stuff. I've been telling friends about the Comstock because this is a good time to get in if it's all true. Of course, everything you invest is a gamble. If you decide to plant turnips, there's no sure bet that the turnip beetle isn't going to come along and wipe out your crop and you'll be bankrupt from it. So anything that's an investment is, by definition, a gamble. But this sounded like about as good a gamble as you could get in a deteriorating age that cannot get better, or cannot get better until it gets a hell of a lot worse. And one of the few things that's going to hold its value and make money, actually, and provide a safety net no matter what happens, are the precious metals, gold and silver. So anyway, I bought in, and then it occurred to me that I'd tell people about it. It's now at 3. My friend thinks within a few months, once they start mining, it should be at 8 or 10. Well, that's pretty good. And of course, if they discover bonanzas, and it looks like the last press release is that they've found something that looks like a bonanza, at least at first blush. So it occurred to me that here was an idea I had for ages and ages and ages, but it just wasn't the technology for doing it, which was micro-investing, micro-financing for various kinds of projects, television projects, films, publishing, whatever, of small bits and pieces. But it was very difficult to administer those when there was no internet around. But now a click of the button makes what was impossible 10 years ago rather easy. This is the scheme, that if people invest in the Comstock, and I don't want to get lawyers involved or anything, strictly voluntary and on a trust basis, anybody listening or your friends or whoever you know buys into the Comstock, let's say for argument's sake you do it now at about 3 and it goes up to, say, triple what you paid for it. So it goes, say, at 9. And when it gets to that triple the amount, then what you do is you transfer a tithe, 10%, of the stock you bought to our production company that I set up with Robert Schock called AKO Enterprises, or to our nonprofit organization, if you're looking for a tax deduction, called the Ancient Wisdom Foundation. So that's the deal. Anybody interested can do that, and just let me know. Anybody who is interested, contact me by email or telephone. We'll discuss it, and I'll tell you how you go about it. I'm not exactly sure how you transfer stocks, but I know you can do it because you hear it on the radio all the time of people saying they're transferring stocks to nonprofit organizations and so on. So that's the plan. That's what we're looking for. And anybody listening not interested in that, but knows people who are interested in financing what almost certainly will be a money spinning project, which is our Zeptepe, and we need quite a bit of financing still to go. We've got enough to start, but we're going to need quite a bit, since we're planning on doing it as a theatrical release, getting it into the movie theaters first before we put it onto television and send it out as DVDs and so on. So anybody who knows anybody who might be interested, get in touch. The Mystery of the Sphinx was, of course, a very popular documentary, one of the most successful of all time, only we didn't get any money out of it because of the contracts that we were obliged to set up when we didn't have a bean and had to sign. And then my criminal partner, the late Boris Said, stole a whole bunch of money out of the till, so nothing really came back from it other than some debts. But still, it was a great adventure, and Boris, without him, I must say, I don't even hold it against him, without him and his immense energy, it never would have happened anyhow. But this one, there's no Boris to worry about, and we've got a really good team with us, an excellent producer and distributor and director, and with a big track record himself. So we expect that this, particularly timed the way it is with all of this stuff going on, we expect that this will be an epical and groundbreaking documentary or film in its own right. I mean, something that really nails down this ancient civilization, lost civilization theory in a way that makes it absolutely irrefutable. Even the quackademics will not be able to challenge it anymore. In turn, it will also, we think, be successful financially. So on that note, I close and pass it over to you. And if you're interested in involving yourself, well, great. Call me or email me. And if you're just interested in watching the progress, well, stay tuned. And I again apologize for the unconscionable delay between PhoenixFire episodes. But as you gather, the combination of genetic inefficiency and incredible workload has just made it impossible to keep up and keep on top of my PhoenixFire blogs. But I hope to be doing more of them, or let's say doing them less infrequently in the near future. Okay, so goodbye until the next time. Thank you.
John Anthony West, PhoenixFire Supplemental.
I'd also like to mention a bit of a kind of an extended footnote here about gold itself, which is a very interesting subject in its own right. Gold has a lot of detractors nowadays among very rich people. Warren Buffett and people like that are always talking about gold as fool's gold, as though there's something immoral about it. Very interesting that these are the guys who have made billions and billions of dollars destroying the world with their hedge funds and derivatives, and they see something immoral about gold. Actually, it's the other way around. From time immemorial, gold has had a special attraction to people. We react to it probably on an atomic level or something like that. There's something esoteric about gold, and it's even in the language. You talk about golden girls, the poetry, golden boys and girls all must like chimney sweepers come to dust. I think that's the A. Houseman poem. We talk about golden years. We talk about going for the gold. It's written into our psyche somehow or another, into all languages. And nothing else has quite that allure to it. I mean, the alchemists are out to produce gold. I mean, the real alchemists, not just the early Wall Streeters who are looking for a way to get money for nothing. The real alchemists were using gold as a symbol for the eternal and the immutable that you could get only through tremendous dedication to a certain kind of inner work. What the alchemists were doing was physical, but it was physical in the interests of, or in the search of, the esoteric and the spiritual. And gold has that for complex reasons, actually, that I hope to detail in an upcoming Trends Journal. I hope to be doing a kind of an extended sidebar on why gold has the value to us that it's supposed to have, just as a side note. Anyway, I'll have that, I hope, in the next Trends Journal. And meanwhile, actually, I'll be trying to figure out a way to get our last Trends Journal onto online somehow or another, so that you can just click on it and see what we're up to with the Trends Journal, because I regard that as it's not my life's work, as it were, but it is my life's work at the moment, and I believe that we're doing something pretty important, Celente and myself and the rest of the people who are working with us. Anyway, I will close with that, and with a bit of luck, I'll be talking more, perhaps in a blog to come, about the esotericism of gold. Meanwhile, I just leave you with that thought. You pursue it as you see fit. Thanks again.
Show notes available at www.jawpenixfire.blogspot.com. Phoenix Fire. Music and production by Geraint Hughes, www.thepodule.com. More information on John Anthony West is available at www.jawest.net.